And we start with our first question, which is that recognizing that very often religious institutions or leading figures within religion are criticized for being patriarchal or for silencing the female voice. The question to our panel members as a start-off is, how far do you think that's a true observation? That many religious institutions and religious leaders are patriarchal and seek to silence the female voice in religious faith?
So I'll start with that one. I think certainly religion has been used to oppress women. Religion can also be used to emancipate women, but that hasn't always been the case, unfortunately. So that would be our world traditions. I just remember being, oh, they want to do something. Thanks, okay, hold it closer, closer, that's better. I remember being on the West Bank in the Palestinian territories, and I was part of the Muslim Leadership Initiative, and we were going into a mosque to pray, and it was a beautiful mosque, but not the women's part, okay? So they took us upstairs to a really hot room where we couldn't even see, you know, the sermon. I couldn't see when to start, we couldn't even hear when to start prayer. We had to look through tiny little holes to try to see what was going on. And I was so angry that afterwards they asked me, do you want to go talk to the imam, about this segregation of women into this awful hot room? And I said, no, better not, not right now. So of course you have, I've written several articles about what's happening in Yemen. Of course there's a war in Yemen right now, but for a long time there's been very little political participation of women in Yemen. Yemen ranks last in the Gender Gap Index, World Bank Gender Gap Index. Political participation has been extremely low. For a while, there was only one woman out of 301 parliamentarians. One, okay? So there's other women in government, not parliamentarians, but in government, but they tend to be given soft positions, like, Minister of Culture or that kind of thing. They don't get to be, they don't get hard political positions. So of course we have a problem, and of course religion plays a role. And so I'd like to let some of these other women also speak to this question.
I think based on my research and experience as an Indonesian, I can continue with what Professor Sophia mentioned earlier about women in politics and women's political participation. I remember when Indonesia started to democratize in 1998, the first thing that came up was whether women can run as a member of parliament, whether women can run as a president. And all these religious authorities and religious institutions said no, because that's not what our religion said so. So there was already a debate about women's in politics and women's public roles. Immediately after we are only about to start being democratized. And then what happened after that? Women were successfully gaining that, and meaning that in terms of electoral reform, women are allocated 30%. And from 9% during the authoritarian government, we managed to get into 17 to 80%. But what happened with that? Those are only the numbers, because in terms of policies, women are continuously being subjected to men's control, to institutional control, to the patriarchal control of this political institution. Political parties do not allow women to have their own voices. It's it's there. So I guess if it is only about religious institution, no, I think it's almost in every institution that patriarchal culture is very strongly silencing women and trying to discriminate and marginalize women.
So yes, I do think, I agree with you that women's voices are silenced and that religious institutions are patriarchal. But I don't think that very many faith leaders do this sort of thing on purpose. And I think that very fact actually, though, serves to obfuscate what's going on. So I don't think the problem is that there's some bad guys in authority who go out of their way to try to silence women's voices. At least, you know, there are some who do that, but not the majority. I think the problem is that our religious institutions are patriarchal at such a deep level that you can actually be a good guy and still unconsciously participate in such silencings. So I think the organization of religious institutions and also many of the ideas that, that comprise our traditions are not structured in such a way as to allow the feminine voice, whatever that might be, to flourish. So my context as a student of Catholic theology, the faith leader I obviously keep hearing about is Pope Francis, who I respect enormously. I have great feelings of affection for him. But when asked about the possibility of having women priests, just a few years back, he not only echoed the prohibition of Pope John Paul II by saying that the subject was not open for discussion, but he did so by hearkening obliquely to a theology of complementarity that says that women and men are created equal but different. And so in this way of thinking, masculinity represents the authority of and activity of God in Christ, and femininity represents the receptivity and obedience of Mary. And so priests have to be male because they represent God, who at some level is an essentially masculine principle. So because Pope Francis is informed by this way of thinking that was supported by the previous two papacies, I think he ends up essentially sacralizing inequality. And he wants there to be equality. He's one of the good guys. Like, it's not his intention to do that. And he even says, you know, we need a deeper theology of women. We need to understand the mystical dimension of the feminine vocation. And it sounds really, really good. But these good intentions are mediated through a set of ideas that, in my opinion, are so problematic that he ends up only reinforcing, doing the opposite of what he intends to do. He ends up, you know, silencing women. So I don't think it's a will thing always, but it's still happening.
Thank you. In relation to that last contribution, do you think a distinction can be drawn between, say, what one might call matters of faith and doctrine and matters of church order? And would that be a way of approaching how one thinks about the roles of women in the church specifically, or in broader questions to comment on how far one can distinguish between religious authority and sometimes cultural norms? But maybe
pass that on.
You're going to pass it on. That's fine.
I'll take it. Yeah. So your question is a really good one. So Paul here is distinguishing between doctrine versus organization. And in the past few decades, hold it up, in the past few decades actually, the laity in many different world traditions have become empowered, certainly within the Islamic context. You have a greater sense that people can access the religious texts themselves. I mean, 100 years ago, it wasn't just that women couldn't read and thus access Islamic orthodoxy. The majority of men also couldn't read and access religious orthodoxy. With the advent of modern education, the laity can become religious experts or quasi-religious experts themselves. At least they can form opinions. It's, in the Islamic world, we no longer just, memorize the Quran and try to recite it verbatim. We no longer just, give all of our decision-making up to the religious leaders. We look at the texts ourselves. There's a lot of discourse about that. So, of course, women are reinterpreting the religious texts themselves. You have Amina Wadud, Fatima Mernisi, Layla Ahmed, Sayyida Sheikh. There's a whole pantheon of women that are doing this. And so they're looking historically at what has been done. Sometimes they're deconstructing Sharia law. Sharia law was formulated during the Abbasid era. And there was a lot of Persian and Zoroastrian influence at the time. And, not to bash the Persians, nobody would want to do that, but there was some misogyny inherent at that time, this notion of pollution versus purity, and the idea that you could have large harems of women. This happened during the Abbasid era in Baghdad with the influence of the Zoroastrians. So then you get Islam, but it's beginning to be mixed with Zoroastrian culture. And so, you know, what I tell my female students in my, you know, Introduction to Islam class is that this is also the time in which Sharia law was formulated. It was a highly androcentric, which means, you know, male-centric time period. So we have to understand that Sharia law is, you know, was not revealed by God. Sharia law was formulated by male scholars during a specific place, or at a specific place during a specific time. And we can unpack it, we can deconstruct it, we can reevaluate it, and women are doing that. Would you like to speak to that, or to any of that?
If you wish, please. No?
Okay, that's good, thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I was teaching a lot more than I am now in teaching religious studies, and we started to have 20, 30 years ago young Muslim women of South Asian background starting in the UK to come and undertake religious studies, what they often said was that they started to experience the opportunity to distinguish between the familial cultural inheritance that they came with and their ability to themselves kind of engage with the Quran, with the Hadith, with trying to form an understanding. At the same time, when this process carried on of trying to distinguish between, if you like, religious authority and cultural form, it was not an easy solution, because the question is, if you peel away the skin of the onion, so to speak, and you keep peeling away the skins, is there anything left? Because all religions ultimately take shape and place in a place and time and in a culture. There's no way for them to exist outside of it. But yeah, this is an interesting set of issues, and thanks for having begun to open it up in relation to this question of authority, patriarchy, and silencing of women's voices. Okay, but if we then take that as part of what you've commented on in terms of the present situation and the inheritance, what observations would you have, and what examples can you give of actually women speaking up and taking the lead in faith movements today, women reclaiming space? Mm-hmm. Can we start perhaps with women in Christian circles?
Yeah. Is this the one? Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Sorry.
Multiple.
Okay, so you know, so some people have said that this is kind of a modern trend, women speaking up, and this is how the question was posed. I think that women have been speaking and leading, and I think that there have been times in history when women's voices have emerged, and then for various reasons they've been silenced again. And I think most grassroots movements begin with a kind of egalitarianism, because everyone who's participating in the culture that produces the movement that emerges. The church that I grew up in North America, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, began as a 19th century movement that was spearheaded by a young female visionary called Ellen White. But as the movement grew and as it was institutionalized, women kind of were left out of the picture. And then they sent, of course, Ellen White off packing to Australia, and here I am, which is about as far away from the institutional church at the time that you could get. And now, nearly 200 years later, the Adventist Church is tearing itself to bits over the question of women's ordination. In a denomination founded by women, who, you know, a woman who frequently preached in churches. In the early church as well, I think there's evidence of women's involvement in its formation, but over time women got pushed out. But something very interesting is happening, you know, about Christian context. Something very interesting now is happening in the Adventist Church, which is that members recently elected a fundamentalist leader of the church. The current president is very, very much a fundamentalist. And he's against female leadership at pretty much every level of the church. And now his war against women is galvanizing women and men to stand up and say, actually, that's not the kind of church that we want to have. and that we want to be. And so I think we're also seeing sort of the same dynamic in the United States with Donald Trump, you know.
Yes.
Having a sexual predator in the White House
Yes.
is forcing women and men to stand up and say, well, wait a second, we don't want to be that kind of a country either.
I'm here to seek asylum.
So then we get women's marches out of the anger of this, and you know, the hashtag MeToo and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think really dark things can be the catalyst for change.
I agree.
Yeah. Pass this on.
Yeah, thank you. An interesting observation, an important one. Sometimes, you know, things are constructed, oh, this is a modern development, but you're reminding us that leadership of women within religious movements actually has a history as well, and it's important not just to construct this in terms of a modern phenomenon. Yeah, please.
I think I can probably start like we have Indonesian female heroines who fought against the Dutch. But of course, at that time, they wasn't thinking about they representing the Islamic voices. But then we have the female heroine called Kartini, and she has been celebrated as the source of inspiration for Indonesian women's movement, because at the time when she was a child, the daughter of a respected family working for the Dutch administration, she was speaking up against child marriage, because that's what happened at her time. Women, when they get period, that means parents can force them to get married, and then, you know, ask adult men to marry these children, and also the practice of polygamy, and that girls cannot go to school. So Kartini, she lives around the 1890s, and then she was standing up against all of these practices and said that, and then actually it was from Islam, because she went to the Islamic scholar and then asked the Islamic scholar, what is Islam said about us girl? And then she said, well, actually the Quran said that you have the same equal rights with the boys. You should go to school, you should not be doing only these things like, you know, the household thing, domestic chores. And she went back home, she said like, I don't want to get married, when her parents told her that she should get married. So this is the early beginning of the women's movement, trying to, you know, voicing for equality, and use Islam, the idea that she learns that actually Quran never said that, you know, being a girl, so you shouldn't go to school, that you should marry at a young age. So and then from then on, we've seen in Indonesia, women are asking for equality in terms of marriage law, for example. And then in 1920s, in the first female women congress, for example, they asked that the government should ban polygamy, because that's massively practiced, just like in, you know, many traditional societies. And so these are the things that continuing until now. So women's movement in Indonesia, largely the issue that they've been dealing with is polygamy, child marriage, and also the idea that women should be concentrating or should work only in the household, that they shouldn't go getting a job and, you know, being a politician, something like that. So.
Thank you.
In terms of reclaiming space, let me first begin with the Yemeni women and their protests in 2011 when the Arab Spring manifested in Yemen. This was launched by Tawakkul Karman, who stood in front of the Sana'a University and began to talk. So she won the Nobel Prize because she started a movement in which Yemeni women, for the first time in their history, were out on the street with their fists in the air, claiming all kinds of rights, human rights, women's rights. They spoke against the government. They asked for daycare. They asked for a 30% quota of female representation in the government. I mean, they were out there. In the beginning, the Salafis, who are the religious conservatives, actually tolerated them After a while, they began to attack them and to try to silence them. And as the war started in 2015, women were silenced, but they still learned how to organize. They still learned that their voices were important. And I'm wondering if they're going to eventually get that 30% quota in government. I'm wondering if any of you know which government has the greatest women participation. So don't answer this, I know you know. You guys know which government? It's not the United States, God no. Okay? It's not a Scandinavian country.
Canada?
No.
India.
No. Rwanda. Rwanda. Because after the genocide there, women were fed up. They demanded a quota. I mean, the men messed everything up, right? They demanded, there was a genocide there, right? They demanded a quota, they demanded female participation, and they got it. And right now, it's something like 60% of women in government. Okay, it's only, in Europe, it's about, on average, about 22%, which is still bad. That's bad. I mean, women need to take leadership positions. I also want to point out, in terms of the Islamic context, we have famously Amina Wadud, who's an African-American Muslim. She prayed in front of men, which is taboo in Islamic communities. She led prayer for men. I believe she was in New York, so of course she was deeply criticized for doing so. But it was quite a moment when she did it. Okay, and then we have a lot of women, I think, in the States, but also outside of the States. A lot of Muslim women are asking for mosques that are reconfigured in a more fair way, where perhaps men and women pray parallel to each other, right? Still separated so that you're not distracted, but so that you have equal access to the sermon, right? They don't have to go up into a room that's hot and no fans working, and they have to look through the little peepholes to see something. Even in deeply conservative countries, like Yemen and like Bahrain, I have visited Salafi women's groups. And remember, the Salafis are very, very puritanical, very, very conservative. But even in these women groups, women have told me that they are still struggling for their rights within Islam. For example, in Yemen, even though Islamically a woman is supposed to be able to inherit at least 1/3 of her parents' property after they die, in Yemen, unfortunately, tribal law sometimes means that their brothers take away that 1/3. So they're fighting to have their Islamic rights. For example, if in Islam, women have the right to ask to be paid if they nurse their children, and they have the right to ask to be paid by their husbands if they clean the house. I know, I know. But so they're struggling to have those rights that Islam, in fact, Islam grants them. And that's in the most conservative of societies. Within the Hizmet movement, also known as the Gülen movement in Turkey, women have been quite active in creating spaces for themselves. They have their own sahbets, which is a moment where they can actually interpret the words of the inspirational figure, Fethullah Gülen. They can read the Quran and interpret it themselves without having men speak for them. And that's very powerful. And in fact, Fethullah Gülen, again, the founder or the inspirational figure behind this movement, has encouraged women to participate at every level of society, and has even told women to learn karate in case they need it to keep their husbands in line.
Well, thank you. And each of the women scholars here has been involved in studying particular movements or particular individuals in terms of situating these issues. So Professor Pandya has just spoken a little bit about these issues in the context of the Hizmet movement, which she's been involved in studying. Do we have some observations also, please, in relation to movements like Muhammadiyah movement in Indonesia?
Yeah, Muhammadiyah is one of the. So Muhammadiyah is one of the first modernist Muslim organization in Indonesia. It was founded in 1911. So the founder went to Mecca to study, and then he learned about the reform movement in Saudi Arabia at that time, he also learned about Muhammad Abduh and his idea of reforming Islam. So he went back to Indonesia, and then this is Indonesia under the Dutch government. And unlike the other Muslim scholars at that time, he was trying to introduce Islam in a more moderate ways. For example, by teaching children playing music, and then also, which is at that time considered as something associated with the Dutch, which is kafir, like unbelievers. But he chose to do that path, and then also he introduced schools, modern school, which means there is no segregated classes, so boys and girls can be in the same room, and they also use chairs instead of sitting on the floor, which was practiced before mostly in most of the areas in Indonesia. So and then in 1920, just for like 8 years after that, Muhammadiyah established the women's wing, which called Aisyah, which is taken from the name of the Prophet's youngest, last wife. And then with the Aisyah, it focuses on providing education for girls and for women, and also trying to improve the health of women, women's health, so reproductive rights, etc. And so that's why the Aisyah movement really focusing on these particular areas by building schools for girls and also building health services, public services. And the other thing I would like to also add, probably in terms of trying to connect with what you mentioned before, like in the Islamic province of Aceh, you probably know this is the province that was hit by tsunami in 2004. And what happened in there is, as soon as because they wanted to introduce Islamic laws, this is the only province in Indonesia that is allowed to have Islamic law. And when the draft was formulated, it was said that only those who can lead a prayer can run for office. And of course, women immediately reacted to that, because when it says only those who can lead a prayer, that means it's actually marginalizing women. It's stopping women from participating in public sphere. So women was inspired by, hang on, that's not what we learned from Islam. And again, like the story of Kartini, because they also learn from the Islamic State University, they learn about, the teaching of the Quran, etc., etc. So they were like protesting against this, and they built a coalition with men as well, and also with women's movement in Jakarta, in outside Aceh, to stop the law to be passed by the local government. Because in Islam, according to conservative interpretation, it's only men who can lead the prayer. So if you have a law, like a secular, if you have a regulation that says you can only run as a for a public office only if you can lead the prayer, that means women will have no chance to run for public office. So that's a story from Aceh that I observed.
Did you want to come back on that, just?
Yeah, so Fatima Mernissi famously argues that there's a hadith, a Muslim hadith. A hadith is, like a saying or an action of the Prophet Muhammad that has been recorded. And so she says that there is a hadith that says that if a woman is if a country has a female leader, that country will, it'll go downhill. So that hadith has been used to, it's like the sledgehammer argument to silence women from taking positions of leadership in the Muslim world. However, of course, Muslim women are not stupid. There's the hadith literature is, those are not the utterances of God, and it has gone through a sifting process. Certain hadiths are weak. Women have questioned, not just women, but many scholars have questioned the authenticity of the various hadiths. So what women have done when they're trying to win positions of power is they've had to couch their own participation in authentic, like Islamically authentic terms. If they say, like we're feminists, we're running out here as feminists, that doesn't always work in traditional settings, because that leaves them open to criticism from their societies. They maybe would say to them, feminism is a Western invention. You're just West-toxicated. You're just, you're trying to, ruin our tradition. You're allowing the West to enter and infiltrate into our own society and culture, and to create something that's not us. And your feminist goals, you should wait, the timing's bad, don't ask for your gender interests now. But so women within these contexts really have to search for authentic, like Islamically authentic models for leadership. So of course they can go to Khadija. Khadija was the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. She was 40 years old when she proposed marriage to the Prophet. And he was 25, okay? 40-year-old women are hot. So, so she was more wealthy than him. She, her wealth, perhaps, to a degree, enabled his prophecy, because she enabled him to not work. He was a merchant. She enabled him to go and meditate in the caves. And so she was a very, very strong female figure, as was another one of his wives, Aisha. So, the trick is to find, the strategy has long been to find another aspect of Islam, another part of Islam that supports women's leadership.
Thank you. Along with movements and reinterpretation of texts and so on, there are also individual inspirational figures in different traditions, and I know that Dr. Davies has made a particular interest and engagement in looking at the figure of Mother Teresa of Calcutta within the broad stream of Western Christian tradition. And it would be helpful if you could share with us some of your evaluations of that in terms of how this figure, this person is placed within that tradition, and in what ways this can be inspirational, in what ways one might have some critiques to offer, and so on.
Well, Mother Teresa has been a point of inspiration for many groups, not all of which all women have found inspiring. On the one hand, you have those who say Mother Teresa was essentially anti-feminist, right? Because of her strong stance against abortion. While on the other side, you have strong conservatives, across genders, who see her as kind of like their woman, their champion. But I think people in the middle see that the truth of Mother Teresa is actually much more complicated than that, and that wherever she sat on the right-left spectrum of things, she herself, as an individual woman, as an individual voice, was a compelling and subversive voice for scores of Catholics who joined her order, Catholic women who joined her order, and for others, including myself. What I love about Mother Teresa, and about her early letters to her male superiors, if you read these things, is that even though, I think I'm losing, oh, there we go, okay. Even though she was very obedient in one sense, and like a good nun, she challenged them with her own authority as one whom she believed had heard the voice of God. And there's no higher authority than that. So the Archbishop of Calcutta, when she was wanting to found her new order, she badgered him to death. And basically saying, I will obey God, and I will obey you as God's representative because I'm just a humble nun, and I have to obey you, and that's the right thing to do. But if you don't let me go and do this work, you're not obeying the voice of God. So she was so tenacious with these kinds of comments that at one point, actually, the Archbishop kind of whined in one of his responses, like, yeah, Mother Teresa, I know, like, you've kind of got the upper hand here. I know God is speaking in this way, but there are all of these issues with, being the Archbishop, and how is it seen, and, a lone European woman going out into the streets of Calcutta. Mother Teresa, you have to take my side every now and again. God or the Archbishop. So whose voice was really guiding that relationship, even though it was couched in all of these interesting ways. So I think Mother Teresa has and can continue to serve as a sign of how, even in contexts where women's voices are being suppressed, they're still heard and they still speak and inspire and triumph.
Thank you. Well, we've had, I think, a rich set of contributions of different examples, different reflections, and towards the end of our panel time, which will be coming up to 7:30, we've got final questions for our panel about how they evaluate the future in relation to these matters. But for now, I think it's time to open this up to discussion from the floor, to questions and points. If you have something that's particularly picking up on something that an individual has said, when you ask the question, could you please indicate that so that colleagues here will know who it's intended for specifically. It doesn't stop, of course, others of you from commenting on it too, but if it's coming specifically out of a point, please direct it to an individual. If it's more general, then just make it as a more general question. If we can try and have questions as distinct from statements, that will be helpful, but we'll have it as a discussion to and fro, I hope. Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to ask Dr. Davies, do you think that part of Mother Teresa's power and attraction for people was that she was nobody's wife?
Oh. I'm not familiar with that expression. Do you?
Well, that she was a nun, a celibate nun.
That's an interesting question. I mean,
the whole thing of nuns and priests living celibate lives has a very bad rap these days, but listening to you speak, I just thought, that's got real power, hasn't it? She's on her own. She's not somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's sister. She's on her own.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I feel like I'm going to need to think about that for a little bit. I mean, I suppose women's religious, nuns in Catholic contexts are called religious, they have always, throughout, the history of the Christian church, had the ability to speak in ways that married women haven't been able to. So if, there's stories of young women from affluent families, that are given to be married away to somebody that the father wants to build a relationship with or whatever, they'll run away to convents, and women like Teresa of Avila, many women in the history of Christian spirituality have been able to speak because of being nuns, and we hear their voices today because of being nuns. So I would not be surprised if if there's something that continues with Mother Teresa. I'm going to think about that question.
Can I just add? There's a really famous book by Carolyn Walker Bynum. You've probably read it, about the medieval period. And so sometimes women would actually escape their domestic fates by joining a convent, and their parents would bring over some guy to marry. Sometimes they'd dirty their faces or jump into the fire or cut their hair or join a convent, right? And so it's just interesting. There's a lot of funny stories about it. And so in one of the sort of funny stories, the nuns sought agency or self-determination by doing things like vomiting the wafer. Like they'd have a priest, and maybe they didn't like the priest. And so every time that priest that they didn't like would do the Holy Communion, they would vomit up the wafer. Or they'd see the demon, they'd see a demon or a devil hovering around his head. And they were able to, empower themselves through doing that. Because what happens, it looks as though, God has made them vomit the wafer, and it looks, they've delegitimized that priest. So even within conservative religious institutions, women are not stupid. Women have, of course, people have strategies for empowering themselves.
My favorite story is, can I say one thing? My favorite story is of Claire and her sister, Agnes of Assisi. And Claire is a noblewoman, and she starts talking with Francis of Assisi. They start chatting, and she runs off in the dead of night, and she has her hair cut, so that when her family comes to drag her back to be married off, she's like, look, Papa, it's bald already. And then her sister, Agnes, does the same thing. And she prays that when her father and people are trying to drag her back, she prays to God that God would help her to be able to live for God alone. And she suddenly becomes as heavy, like as a boulder. And her father can't actually pick her up and bring her back home because she's so heavy. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Okay, thank you. So we have a new recruitment drive for the Women's Religious Orders here tonight. Yes.
I am a religious sister. I am a religious sister, and I can hear the stories, but it does give you an independence. You know, it's part of the life choice, and I think that's linking into what you're saying there.
Being a wife
we live
and a
in community, so we are dependent on each other, but it's different to having a spouse. It's quite a different reality.
And being a mother as well.
And yes, so there are certain freedoms it gives, and there is an independence that it can foster within you. So but it's also a vocation. So it's not an escape from marriage. It's not an escape, when your parents are trying to make you get married or something like that. It is a vocation, and it is a calling with its own specificity. But it does, and I mean, we have some great examples in our history. We have some great examples today of women who are members of religious congregations and who have done fantastic things in our world. And the other flip side of the thing is there's a freedom that you're not, if you want to take a path that is a bit prophetic, and that's partly how we see our role within the Catholic tradition, that you're not upsetting the lives of your husband and your children. And so there's a freedom that comes from that as well. But I do just want to stick up and say it is essentially a vocation. It's a way of understanding ourselves too.
Of course.
So,
yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah, that's absolutely first. Yeah.
Anything else to this kind of point for a moment? Up the back here, and then we'll come here in a minute.
This question is about ladies, but thank you so much for the rest of the panelists for being here. You spoke earlier about how Pope Francis calling for a deeper theology of women actually perpetuates the patriarchy. Can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, so I think it's the context, as I tried to explain, out of which he says that, which has roots in the theology of the body, and that John Paul II was well known for, in this idea of the genders being somehow deeply embedded in the fabric of reality. So God has to be essentially masculine, even though God is not a man. Of course, God is not gendered, but as the active principle, as the authority, that is a masculine thing, and so a priest has to be a man because the priest is representing God and God's activity in Christ, and so women cannot have an authority because we symbolize as women. We symbolize receptivity. We symbolize obedience, and so there are calls to get a richer theology of women, but it's in that same direction, right? Using that same kind of metaphor. And it sounds very mystical and wonderful, and but I fear that it only seeks to kind of harden that kind of inequality, because then it becomes suddenly a holy inequality, or of course they say it's equal but different. But practically, in the church structure, when all of the authority, masculine authority figures, all men, and all of the men are making the decisions, who's organizing that theology? Who is coming up even with that theology? It's men. Women aren't being asked about if that's how we see our view. That said, there are women who, do agree with that. So I'm only one female voice, and there are women who are quite happy with that kind of theology. But I think I know a lot of us women don't find that a helpful way of talking about the theology of women.
I would like to follow up the first question and the talk of the nun about vocation. In terms of religion, when the people when the people use vocation, there are different levels of vocation. In a country such as in Vietnam, education is very expensive, and the Catholic parents have to provide music. There's a lot of things in order to get into the convent, so it's not cheap. And in terms of why the nun chose to leave, it seems very strange to me that like in South Vietnam before the communist came, many Catholic educated people, it means they have a decree that they make the decision to go into the convent. And now I also listened to the radio, and the nun from Vietnam came and respond for the leprosy camp, and they say that they choose to live there as a family member. It means that they will serve the other people like their own family. It means if they are older, they are mothers. If they are younger, they are sisters. If they are little, then they are niece and nephew. It means they merge into the family, and they do not have anything about their own. And that's why they said that comes from God. And I think that comes from God too, because I look at them and I don't think I will do it. I can't live with the other people, and especially understand that my father didn't give me the education in order to become a nun. So when I went overseas, I still keep on studying, and I look around and I found out that there are different thinking in here: sex, power, authority, and many Catholic nuns, they end up their relationship. They met at university to become a nun, so they chose to become a nun, and there is no question further about sex, family, or anything, and you have to merge into it. And after the communist came, they mix the rice with the sand, and if you cannot pick out the sand, the people eat it, and they will die, and you have to bury them as a family member.
So I just want to clarify that when I spoke about Carolyn Walker Bynum's book, she was talking about medieval women, and I mean this was during a time period where there were no C-sections and no antibiotics, so a lot of women died in childbirth. And so she was noting that, and she was, theorizing that many women joined for that reason. So I wasn't talking about today's nuns. Clearly, joining the convent today is a choice, a profession, a vocation. Interestingly, Carolyn Walker Bynum also spoke about the nuns and how they were able to relate to Christ with their bodies, through their bodies. They could see that as Christ bleeds, so they also bleed. As Christ suffers, so they also suffer. And so sometimes they were able to, not just be married to Christ, but see themselves in Christ, and vice versa.
Okay, in the middle here. Okay. Sorry.
As one of the blokes here today, I always find it interesting to overhear what is generally, I think, a women's conversation taking place here. I came here today wondering about the place of matriarchy alongside patriarchy, and you jumped straight into the discussion of patriarchy. Whether those two things are, whether that in fact matriarchy has never existed, or whether it's something which exists alongside patriarchy, whether there's some reflection on that. Just as a slight aside on the whole religious sister question, interestingly here in Australia we have 3 in one canonized saint, 2 others in the process, one already servant of God, another very remarkable woman who exercised her own individuality by becoming a doctor and serving in India, Mary Lowry, but Carolyn Chisholm's on the way as well. And I recently read a bit of a biography of her, and I think her husband ought to be in line for sainthood as well, given how much he supported her work all the way through her career and her vocation there. But it's just, so I'm just wondering, is there always going to be an agonism between matriarchy and patriarchy, or is there some way the two exist or can exist together?
Thank you. Comments?
Would you like to say something about it?
There certainly are, I think, some matriarchal cultures that have been around. I think we talk so much about patriarchy because we experience so much of it.
Well, maybe I can mention Aceh and also West Sumatra is one of the, are the only two places in Indonesia where matriarchy has a very strong influence. And that's why if we look at the history or the discussion about women's movement and the fight for gender equality, and a lot of people would say that because of this matriarchal society, then that's why they are more successful. The women from Aceh, for example, that's why they're successful in, for example, like the story I mentioned before, stopping that Islamic law to be like that. And also in West Sumatra, the same thing. And so that's why many of Indonesian feminists sometimes accuse, or not accuse, like pointing women from West Sumatra and Aceh and from Aceh as a post-feminist, because they don't believe that they have to fight for anything, because they feel already in the society they have a special place in the society. So that's probably something that I can contribute.
I don't think there's a whole lot of matriarchal societies today. There just aren't, really. But there is matriarchy, and there are matriarchs. And maybe that's mother-in-law power, right? Mother-in-laws wielding it over their daughters-in-laws. If you saw a big fat Greek wedding, there's the notion that so the man is the head of the family, but the woman is the neck that turns the head, right? And then there's single mothers, you know, and also grandmothers. Grandmothers, you know, hold the world together. Probably, I'm a grandmother. Can the grandmothers raise their hands? I mean, we hold the world together. Yeah. But you know, recently I read a really interesting theory about matriarchy and patriarchy and gender dynamics within the family. When you have really patriarchal, authoritarian gender dynamics at the family level, so the first difference, like a brother has more power in the family than his sister, and the father has, you know, wields more power than the mother, more authority. This actually is reflected at the state level. So then you have authoritarian governments, and actually that means that the government is unstable. Patriarchy leads to governmental instability. Patriarchy is not just bad for women, it's also bad for men, by the way, because if they have to be, you know, aggressive, hyper-masculine, that, you know, women live longer than men. Men die from stress-related diseases. But so it's not just that, but it's also bad for society because of, you know, state instability. So let's just consider, think about Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan. You have highly patriarchal societies, and you have state instability. So you can think about that for a while.
Perhaps some of our discussion has been focused, particularly because also the contributions from colleagues here around Christianity and Islam, around Muslims and Christians. There are, for example, in Hindus, in Nepal, we've had reference to polygamy. There's also in Nepal polyandry, for example. So there are issues that, you know, can be explored. But I think we've had some exploration of some things in relation to the Christian tradition, specifically so far. I'd be glad if anybody who wants to ask a question or make a contribution in relation to Islam in particular, perhaps.
Hi, my name is Corinne Dekker. I work at Afrianty. I'm a sociologist. And we do research on the impact of the visibility of religion on the ways in which people live together. And one of the findings that we had is
really weird. One of the findings that we had, I'll just yell at you. One of our findings was that the impact of visibility or of being visibly religious, Muslim or Catholic or any other kind of religion, it kind of distances people from each other. And the most discussed item is the facial covering. And I was wondering if both Muslim experts here could elaborate a little bit about on the discussion within the Muslim community about the facial covering for women. Do you need it? Do you not need it? What does the Quran say about it?
Why don't you go first? Unless you don't want to. Yeah. Okay. I'll give her a moment to collect her thoughts. So that's a really good question. The first thing that struck me when I arrived to Yemen for my first trip in 2000 was that all of the women were wearing a face veil, and it was intimidating for me in the beginning. After a while, I began to be able to recognize the differences between the women, and on a subsequent trip, I actually bought my own face veil. There's a lot of reasons to wear a face veil. I'm not trying to say that the face veil is good or bad. I'm just trying to point out that there are reasons to wear it. One reason that Muslim women tend to cite for wearing the face veil, other than modesty, is that it allows them for social mobility. In a really highly patriarchal society, sometimes their male family members are reassured that nothing's going to happen to them and that nothing will happen to their family honor if the woman, walks to work or walks to the mall and she has her face covered, because that protects her and protects the family honor. Yemen is quite, an honor-shame society, it really is. Another thing I wanted to say is that while I was in Bahrain, first of all, during the 70s, women wore miniskirts in Bahrain, okay? The face veil and the abaya began to be worn after the success of the Iranian Revolution. So that was 1979. And so during the 80s, you got the Islamic resurgence in Bahrain, and women began to cover and also, in some occasions, cover their face. So there's a few things I want to say about that. One of them is that sometimes they go to the university and cover their faces. Then they go to the mall and they take the face veil off. Okay? And then, if they're going to a wedding, they put on their really fancy abaya covered with sequins and maybe feathers. And maybe, their really fancy face veil. And maybe they're going to cover, beautify their eyes to the extent where they look, sexy. Maybe a really tight abaya. I've seen that. So we can't draw conclusions about what the abaya means. Certainly, it can be distancing, and I agree that it can be distancing. It's just hard to see the woman's expression, so that can be an issue.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I gave you time.
The reason is because in my research, looking at women in Southeast Asia, full face is not something that is common in Southeast Asia, but it has been a recent trend in Indonesia, for example. In Malaysia, I think they started earlier than us in Indonesia than in Indonesia. But this is an interesting thing that I can share. If, for example, in the Middle East or in Yemen, the wearing of chador or full face is, full black, right? But in Indonesia, they were very colorful, like can be pink, red, and in the era of the social media, I can see like even some of my friends started to use that. And I asked them like why? Because they said, I just feel comfortable. And you know what? This is like female from upper class Indonesians wearing, all branded handbag with, very colorful dress, abayas, and not black. So if you go to Indonesia and you look at what happened there, yes, they started to wear full face, but it's not black. And I think this has something to do with the transnational Islamic movement, because that's not the wearing of headscarf, because in the past Indonesian women only wear like this, and then like this. That's it. This is even the Muhammadiyah women's and also the Nahdlatul Ulama women. They're not wearing the one like, you know, the square headscarf. So it was the Iranian Revolution that actually influenced the way Indonesian women wear and cover their hair. And then now, I think in the last 5 years, we have this influence of, you know, abayas and also long dress, because before it was like, you know, it's different. So that's interesting to see how everything has been going on in Indonesia and also in other parts of the world. And then in recent event that happened in Iran, where women are asking for the government to lift the compulsory headscarf. Actually, in Indonesia, Indonesian women are asking for more regulation onto their personal life. So this is something that, you know, for me it's quite interesting to see how things are being played.
So would you say it's mainly a cultural thing and less a religious thing?
So let me just say that it represents a lot of different things for different women. I was going to just tag team to her and say that one of the problems that many Muslim women face is cultural and religious authenticity. And so how do you, so if, for example, in Bahrain or in the United Emirates, how can you present yourself as, you know, authentically Muslim, authentically Arab, given, you know, Western global dominance? So oftentimes women pick it because it's a style that signals to others that they are authentic. Of course, you know, the abayas are almost always made out of rayon, which is, you know, not, you know, they're being traditional but with a very modern fabric. So of course there's paradox after paradox. It can, you know, for some it's a reaction to Western cultural dominance. For some it's piety. For some, it's just culture, it's peer pressure, everybody else is doing it. I actually went to buy my abaya in Yemen, and I thought I'd be in and out. I mean, they're all black, right? In and out. How long is this going to take me? I went in and it took me an hour. I'm not kidding. Some had little sequins, some had little buttons, some were very tight, some were, you know, really baggy. It took me an hour until I found one that, you know, expressed the inner Sophia.
And actually, if I can add, yesterday there was the second biggest state Islamic university in Indonesia, which is in Yogyakarta, banned 40 female students who are wearing full veil. And of course, there is a very controversial policy. Some Indonesians saying that this is wrong, women should be allowed to choose whatever they want, but then the other group said that's the right thing to do because this is a public space, they shouldn't be doing that. So that's an interesting 40 female students. So now the university is organizing sort of like giving them training, talking to them, trying to understand why they choose to full face, and then if by the end of next week they still said that they are going to continue wearing it, and then that means they will be dispelled from the university, which is, that's...
Well, our time is coming to near an end, and there's a lot of people here. There's been some opportunity for question and comment, but not, I know, for everybody, but I'm sure one or two from the panel will be able to remain a little bit at least and have some informal individual discussion with them. I did want to end up by giving panelists an opportunity just to give an evaluation of how you see the future for opportunity and inequality in relation to women in faith traditions. How you yourself see that future, how you evaluate it.
That's a very grand question.
Answer it as you wish, or pass it on. Yeah.
Well, I can only speak for the North American, European, who's Australian context, but I think we have a long way to go. And I think we keep thinking that we see the way forward, and then we realize that our attempts at promoting gender equality have only exposed deeper levels of patriarchy. And as you said, patriarchy hurts men as well as women. But since women can now vote and run for office and in some contexts serve as clergy, we think, well, we've gotten somewhere, and the inequities get sublimated and become more insidious. But I do think we have reasons to be hopeful. So when I was in my teens and early 20s, I was sponsored to go to a conference for young training clergy. And I remember walking in there, and there were all of these older women pastors who were gathering, and one of them began the prayer, "Our dear Heavenly Parent." And I sneered. You know, I was 19 years old. Oh, feminism. And I get it now. Lived in the world a bit longer, and I get it now. But I'm encouraged because I think more young women, I think the younger women now aren't like that. I think that more of them are seeing some of the issues and are valuing the struggle of our mothers and grandmothers in ways that I missed 15 years ago. And maybe that's because of the women's marches, because of #MeToo. But thousands of years of inequity are not going to be solved in a few decades or in a couple centuries. I think that we're just now beginning to realize how complicated the issues are, and how many layers there are. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
Well, thanks for the word complicated, because that's exactly also what I have been dealing with my research, with my own research, in terms of what's the future like, especially with my research on Indonesia and Southeast Asia, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, that there is now a trend, the influence of trans national Islamic movement, which suddenly changed the way Indonesian Muslims practice Islam. And of course, the rise of socio-cultural and political Islamism under Indonesian democracy, that's also, I think, pose a serious challenges for Indonesian Muslim feminists and also Indonesian moderate Muslims. Last year, about 600 Indonesian female ulama gathered in West Java, in the province of West Java. They call it as the biggest ever congress of female ulama. And these women, these female ulama, are religious scholars. They get their religious education from the traditional Islamic boarding schools and from the Islamic university across Indonesia. And they work with the community. They own their own Islamic schools. They also lead their Islamic university, and they live closely to the problems and issues that women are dealing in their everyday lives. And so during that conference, during that congress, they believe that the discriminations, that marginalization and silencing of women comes from what Professor Sophia mentioned earlier, because the religious authority who define what women can or cannot do are defined by men. So they're taking the opportunity to claim that space. But the problem, I think now, we have also seen a group of Muslims who believe that the sort of equality and personal freedom that these female ulama are asking are heavily influenced by the conception of justice and rights that comes from the West, not from the original teaching of Islam. So I think that's going to be continuously being the center of the battleground of, they're all Muslims, they believe in equality, but it's just about where they have to define it and how they have to define it that is going to be a problem. But I can say that from my research, I come with the conclusion that the single largest events where women were able to sort of like exercise their freedom is the fact that 80% of divorce cases in Indonesian religious court are divorce petitioned by women, and they are all successful. So I guess, court has been a very successful place where Muslim women can get their freedom and can ask for equality. Maybe I can stop there.
Since this is the last time I get to hold the mic, let me take a moment to thank the sponsors as well. So I thank the Australian Intercultural Society, also the Australian Catholic University. This is a beautiful place. And then Zaman Magazine, and my friend, the editor of Zaman, who's Hakan Yeshilova. Zaman's a lovely publication. I actually have several articles in it, and it combines, it looks at the intersection between spirituality and science. So it's a very good magazine to subscribe to. So when we think about the future of women within our religious traditions, of course it's a mixed future. Of course we can't just, I'm not going to give everybody a platitude or end on some great rosy note. Things get worse for women with political turmoil. In the past, male soldiers would fight male soldiers. Today, more women and children are killed in wars, and we also have women that become, refugees during political turmoil. Some women have to turn to prostitution. You get food insecurity. It's really a terrible thing, and oftentimes the wars are, political turmoil is decided on by men. Right? Women didn't even have a say, but they are victims of political turmoil. This is certainly true in Syria, certainly true in Iraq, Yemen, and Turkey, the Turkish context. So things also become worse for women during the colonial period and also in the post-colonial period, because when you have men that feel emasculated, emasculation anxiety leads to patriarchal readings of the religious texts. Okay, and it also can lead to domestic violence. By the way, emasculation anxiety can lead to domestic violence against women. And then you have, of course, you have populism. So since 2006, you have the decline of both liberal and electoral democracy and the rise of populism. And populism, we can say a lot about populism, but populism can be viewed through gendered lenses as a form of aggressive hypermasculinity. And right now I have a sexual predator, ruling my country, which is appalling. Okay, it's just appalling. And so the United States is not the only place that has a populist leader. Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, also Venezuela, also Turkey, and I'm sure you can think of 6 other places in 10 seconds. So women don't do well under populism. They don't. We have to think really carefully, and we have to strategize about how to change, at least how to fight within this environment. We need better laws that protect women. We need to emphasize democracy, liberal and electoral forms of democracy. We need better education. We need to think about not just that women are educated, but what we're teaching them to do. What we're teaching and allowing them to do. Religious leaders need to be better trained on issues such as domestic violence, issues such as women's empowerment. Even, religious institutions need to make spaces for women. They need to pause and just let women speak. All of those things are very important. Even given the global environment, I think we have to push against populist leaders. We have to push against patriarchal religious leaders, and feel our own power, assert our own power. And we need men. We need men to help women, most certainly. Thank you.
Well, I think there's nothing else for me to do except before just introducing at the end somebody from the Australian Intercultural Society, just to give a final word of thanks. But I would like, on your behalf, to thank our panellists very much for giving us a rich evening, and I hope you'll do so in the traditional way here in terms of giving a warm